It was an ordinary Monday afternoon when my husband Daniel casually mentioned some surprising news. He had been asked to attend a week-long business trip overseas. This meant I would be alone in the house for the first time in years. Although I knew it was part of his job, a pang of anxiety surged through me at the thought of being by myself for so long. Daniel smiled, packed his bags, and reassured me that he would check in every night. He kissed me on the forehead, waved, and left. Once he was gone, the house felt eerily quiet too empty, almost as if it wasn't mine anymore. I tried to fill the silence by keeping myself busy working, binge-watching my favourite shows, and taking long walks around the neighbourhood. The first 2 days passed without much trouble, but by the third evening, something changed. I was curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, trying to distract myself with a book, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a flicker of unease mixed with curiosity ran through me. When I opened the door, there stood Ethan, Daniel's best friend. He held a bottle of wine in one hand and wore that familiar, easy smile. "Hey, Claire," he said casually. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how you're doing. Daniel mentioned his trip and I figured you might want some company." I laughed nervously and stepped aside to let him in. "You didn't have to do that, but it's nice to see you." Ethan and Daniel had been inseparable since college, their friendship built on years of shared experiences and loyalty. I had known Ethan for almost as long as I'd known Daniel, but we had never spent much time alone together. It was always the three of us or a larger group. He was a constant presence in our lives, but beyond his role as Daniel's best friend, I had never thought much about him. We settled into the living room, pouring the wine and catching up on life. We talked about work, mutual friends, and how Daniel was adjusting to his trip. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and before I knew it, I was laughing more than I had in days. Ethan had a way of making everything feel lighter. That night, I realized I had never truly noticed how charming and genuinely kind he could be. As the evening wore on, a subtle shift occurred between us. There was an ease in the way Ethan listened to me, his attention entirely focused on what I was saying. It felt good, refreshing even. I hadn't felt this kind of connection in a long time. At one point, I noticed his gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual. It wasn't inappropriate, but it felt different, charged with something unspoken. There was a tension, and though neither of us acknowledged it, I could feel it settling in the air. I brushed off the feeling, telling myself it was just the wine, the loneliness of being away from Daniel, or maybe even my imagination. After all, Ethan was Daniel's best friend, and I was Daniel's wife. There was no reason to read into anything. I excused myself, saying it was getting late, and Ethan smiled, thanking me for the company. As soon as the door closed behind him, a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Something had shifted, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The next morning, I woke up feeling unsettled. The evening with Ethan replayed in my mind more than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of having company after a few lonely days. But as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. There was a strange undercurrent in our conversation that I hadn't noticed at the time, but couldn't ignore now. I tried to distract myself with work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan and the way I felt in his presence. By late afternoon, the unease became too much to bear. I picked up the phone and called my best friend, Sophie, one person who would listen without judgment. "So Ethan came by last night," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Ethan? Daniel's friend? What for?" Sophie asked, her voice immediately curious. He just stopped by to check in, I guess. We had some wine and talked. It was nice. I hesitated, unsure how to put my feelings into words. But what? She pressed. I sighed. There was this moment I can't really explain it. It wasn't anything, but it felt like something. Sophie was silent for a moment. And what did he do exactly? Nothing, I quickly replied. That's the thing. It wasn't anything specific. It was more like a feeling, like we both knew something we weren't supposed to. Maybe it was just the wine talking, Sophie offered. Sounds like you're overthinking it. Maybe, I said, though I wasn't convinced. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to put the conversation out of my mind, but Ethan seemed to occupy every corner of my thoughts. It was absurd. Really, he was just being a good friend. I told myself there was no need to blow things out of proportion. Later that evening, as I sat down for dinner, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. Had a great time last night. Hope I didn't stay too long. I stared at the message, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't quite explain. I typed out a few different replies before settling on something simple. Not at all. It was nice to have company. A few minutes later, another message came in. Glad to hear that. I was thinking of stopping by again tomorrow if you're free. No pressure, of course. I hesitated, feeling a mix of anticipation and guilt swirling inside me. Part of me wanted to say no to avoid whatever this was turning into, but another part, the part that had felt lonely and disconnected for days, was tempted. Nothing would happen, I reassured myself. It was just another friendly visit. Sure, tomorrow works, I replied, before I could overthink it. The next day was a blur of nervous energy. I found myself thinking about Ethan's visit with a mixture of excitement and dread. Was I setting myself up for something I couldn't control? Or was it all in my head? That evening, when Ethan arrived again, he brought takeout, and we sat down at the kitchen table, sharing a meal like we had countless times before. But this time, the tension between us was undeniable. Every laugh, every glance felt charged, as if we were both aware of the unspoken connection between us, but were too afraid to acknowledge it. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn to Ethan in a way that made me feel both excited and terrified. There was a familiarity between us that felt comforting but also dangerous. I caught myself wondering what it would be like if things were different, if we weren't tied to other people. Without thinking, I blurted out, "Ethan, do you ever wonder what would happen if we weren't tied to anyone else?" He looked at me, surprised but not shocked. There was a long pause before he answered, his voice quiet but firm. "I've thought about it more than I should." My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't expected that response, and the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. "I'm sorry," I stammered, feeling a wave of guilt wash over me. "I shouldn't have said that." Ethan shook his head. "No, don't apologize. I felt it too, but I don't want to mess anything up. You and Daniel, that's sacred." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what we were both feeling. I nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over me. "Yeah," I whispered, "I love Daniel." "I know," Ethan said softly. "And I respect that, but it's hard being around you sometimes." For a long moment, we sat in silence, both of us processing the reality of what was happening. We had acknowledged something that neither of us wanted to admit, and now there was no going back. The line between friendship and something more had blurred, and we were dangerously close to crossing it. Ethan stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I should go before we do something we can't take back." I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he walked out the door. The house felt even emptier than before, and I was left with a complicated mess of emotions swirling inside me.